Raymond, well, it's your time now. Please come here. Raymond Kurzweil, изобретатель, футуролог, автор концепции технологической сингулярности, первый разработчик первого планшетного сканера, человек, который создал систему распознавания текста и синтеза звука, человек, который ведет национальный зал славы изобретателей США. Raymond, it's not your biography, it's just a brief introduction into it. So, if you have a look here, it's your countdown. Здесь у всех выступающих будет обратный отсчет. It's your time now.
It's a pleasure. How's that? Well? Yeah. Hear me? It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's exciting to have a Congress like this, particularly here in Moscow. It's my first trip, but I'm delighted to be here. I went to a school named MIT in the Boston area. It's a leading technology school in the United States. I actually went there because MIT was so advanced in 1965 that it actually had a computer. Most schools didn't have one. This computer I carry around is actually several billion times more powerful per dollar or per ruble than that computer. It's a million times cheaper, several thousand times more powerful, and that's typical of information technology. I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who has a dual degree from MIT in computer science and creative writing. That was very unusual. In fact, there were very few people who majored in creative writing or literature at MIT. I'd say half of the authors we studied were Russian authors, particularly from the 19th century, but also some modern ones. And a lot of the mathematicians we studied in computer science were also Russian, like, for example, Markov, in the late 19th century, created a theory of Markov chains and hidden Markov models. That is actually the #1 method or algorithm used in artificial intelligence today. I began using them in speech recognition in the early 1980s, and then we applied them to natural language understanding. There was recently an IBM computer that won the Jeopardy game, which is a game in English. I don't know if there's a Russian equivalent, but it's a language game. It's a popular television show. And the computer was able to defeat the best 2 human Jeopardy players. Those models are largely based on Markov models. And I'm writing a book on the brain now, and I have a theory as to how the neocortex works. And there's basically one module that recognizes a pattern, and that is repeated 300 million times by my estimate. And they're organized in hierarchies. So at the very bottom you have little recognizers that recognize, the little parts of letter shapes, a crossbar and a capital A and so on. At a high level you have recognition of things like humor and irony, jealousy. They're actually the same pattern recognizers, but they exist at different levels in the conceptual hierarchy. And this very complex wiring we see in the neocortex, which is 80% of the human brain, that's where we do our thinking, doesn't come pre-designed. That is actually wired by these little modules themselves based on what they learn. So depending on what you actually think about and learn, it's actually creating wiring to generate this elaborate hierarchy of patterns. And it enables us to actually understand information in a hierarchical fashion. And the world is inherently made up of hierarchies. We have forests, which are made up of trees, and trees are made up of branches, and branches are made up of little branches are made up of leaves, and so on. There's a natural hierarchy to the world. We have a neocortex that can understand that. Only mammals have that. And in my book, I describe actually the method, the algorithm that's used by these 300 million pattern recognizers. So people, I actually looked up on on Google. There's 4 million quotations on Google saying how incredibly complex the human brain is. But this book I'm writing is not adding to that collection of quotations. I really explain a fairly simple approach, relatively simple, that is repeated 300 million times. It's able to self-organize into these elaborate hierarchies. So by the time you get to be our age and you've experienced life, the neocortex is complex, but it actually starts out fairly simple. This method actually turns out to be what are called hidden Markov models. It was invented or discovered by this Russian mathematician in the late 19th century. So this is all an elaborate way of saying I'm happy to be here in Moscow and in Russia, where there is a great tradition of learning, both in culture and science and math. And I think that positions Russia very well for the future world, because the future world is going to be based on creating new knowledge. And one of the things that children need in order to enter that world is an appreciation of the knowledge of the past, and also an awareness of that knowledge so that we can build future knowledge. I was asked yesterday, we had a panel, what would I recommend for Russian education? It's really the same thing that I recommend everywhere, all throughout the world, certainly true in my country, in the United States. We have an educational system that's still based on the 19th century, which is teaching kids a lot of knowledge and information. Some of that is useful so that we can appreciate the cultural foundation that we inherit from the past. We can't create the future without it. But we really do carry our knowledge with us. We can access all human knowledge with a few keystrokes. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to more knowledge than the president of the United States or Russia did 15 years ago. These are very powerful tools. What we really need to teach children is how to create new knowledge. And the best way to do that is actually doing their own projects. And this is a mission that I have, to bring this kind of entrepreneurial spirit, the spirit of actually learning by doing, into the schools. I started a university called Singularity University. It's, I co-founded with Peter Diamandis of the X Prize Foundation. It's backed by Google. NASA, the American Space Agency, provided us a campus in Silicon Valley in California. And we have about 60 faculty, and we have 80 students from all around the world, including Russia. And half of the curriculum is actually doing projects. These students self-organize into teams. They take on some world challenge, hunger, availability of water, applying three-dimensional printing to printing out modules to create new housing, and actually invent technologies of the future. And those projects may very well work out, change the world. Even if they don't, it's really the best way to learn. You know, what I remember from my youth and from my education is really from my own projects, because I've been doing projects since I was 5. It's really the best way to learn. We should bring that spirit of learning by doing into high schools, junior high schools, elementary schools. And I think we have an outstanding foundation here in Russia, but I will say that it's really one world now. I happen to be traveling around the world in October of 2008 when the current financial crisis started, the current worldwide recession. And literally within 1 week, every industry in every country, I happen to be in 5 different continents that month, was suddenly affected. So it's not just a poetic sentiment that we're all connected. It really is one world economy. It's increasingly one world culture with many traditions feeding into it. A country like Russia or the United States are not islands. People ask me, the United States, well, how is the United States going to compete with emerging countries like China. And, you know, it's really not a zero-sum game. An engineer in Russia or China or Africa creates, let's say, a breakthrough in solar panels. That benefits everyone. It's one world economy. But education, particularly learning by doing, I think is the key to the future. It was alluded to earlier that the pace of change is getting faster and faster. That's something that I've studied and that I'm going to talk to you about. I happened to give a speech on the 500th anniversary of the University of Basel about a year ago. And this university was started 20 years after Gutenberg invented the printing press, not too far away from where he made that invention. I said, wow, that's exciting. You must have had some of Gutenberg's books when you opened your doors, something like 1440. And they said, yes, we got them very quickly. It was only 100 years later. That is how technology moved in those days. It actually took 400 years for the printing press to reach a large audience. The telephone did that. It reached a quarter of the population in the United States, Europe, and Russia in about 50 years. Cell phones did that in about 7 years. Social networks, wikis, blogs, some other recent technologies have done that in 3 years. So the pace of change is getting faster and faster. And what's driving that is what I call the law of accelerating returns, which is the exponential growth of information technology. Now, the way I encountered that, I decided I wanted to be an inventor when I was 5, as I mentioned. And I realized 30 years ago, 1981, I started to think about the fact that if I looked around at the inventors who were successful, their timing was perfect. They did things at exactly the right time. Turns out that timing is important for just about anything. Whether it's a business investment or romance, you got to be in the right place at the right time. And most inventors actually get their projects to work, but usually inventors are too early or they're too late. So I wanted to study technology trends. Could I anticipate where the world would be by the time I finished the project? If a project takes, let's say, 3 or 4 years, it will be a different world 3 or 4 years later. That's certainly true today, but it was also true in 1981. So I started to think, you know, you can't shoot at the target where it is. It's like skeet shooting. You have to figure out where it's going to be. Can I anticipate where technology will be? And so being an engineer, I gathered a lot of data. I did not expect really to find anything very predictable. The common wisdom was, and still in most quarters is, that you cannot predict the future. The future is unpredictable. And there's certainly many good examples of people who have made bad predictions in the past about the future. But I made a very surprising discovery. If you measure the underlying properties of information technology, for example, the power of computers per unit currency, instructions per second per constant dollar, for example, or the number of bits we're moving around wirelessly in the whole world, or the number of base pairs of DNA we're sequencing. I could mention 100 other measures like that. They follow very predictable trajectories. And what that predictable trajectory is an exponential progression. It basically doubles every period of time. That doubling time actually itself gets faster and faster. The world of computation, of computers, started with the collection of the United States Census in 1890. It's been growing exponentially ever since. The power of computers for the same price doubled every 3 years, around 1900, every 2 years, around 1950. It was 12 months in the year 2000. It's now down to 11 months. But it's a very smooth, very predictable exponential trajectory. So I had this curve, and I'll show it to you, up through 1980, 1981. I continued the curve through 2050. Now we're at 2012, and we're exactly right on that curve. the power of computation has continued to flow exactly on that curve. And so not only is it predictable, well, what's predictable is that it grows exponentially, and exponentials are very surprising. They're also not our intuition. We have an intuition about the future. The reason we have a brain is, in fact, to predict the future. That's why we have intelligence. So when I walked through the fields 1,000 years ago, I would be walking and say, okay, there's an animal going that way, I'm going this way, and I'd make a prediction, we're going to cross paths in about 2 minutes, I'm going to go this other way. And that turned out to be good for survival. And I was making a prediction about where I would be, where the animal would be, and then made a decision. That's why intelligence is useful. Those predictions about the future, though, were linear. I assumed I was going to just keep going at the same speed. I assumed the animal was going to do the same thing. That actually is correct, and that works out quite well when it comes to the kinds of problems we needed to solve 1,000 years ago. It turns out to be very inaccurate when it comes to predicting the future of information technology. Not any technology. In fact, technologies, before they become information technologies, progress linearly, like health and medicine. I'll talk about that in a moment. But once it becomes an information technology, it progresses exponentially, and that's not our intuition. So one of the differences between my own predictions, which I now have a 30-year track record, which have been very accurate, and my critics, is that they're using their intuition, which is hardwired in our brains, which is a linear prediction of the future, but it's simply not accurate when it comes to information technology. Now you might think, well, what difference does it make? Is it really that different between a linear and an exponential projection? Well, it doesn't make much difference in the short term. It makes a huge difference in the long term. If you look at most models that governments use, for example, to predict the future, in the United States we have debates about Social Security, which is our old age retirement plan for the nation, and the predictions that in 27 years it will run out of money. They're all based on linear predictions of the future. Those linear predictions work actually quite well for a year or two. They're totally ridiculous when it comes to 10 or 20 years. If I take 30 steps linearly, that's our intuition about the future. 1, 2, 3, 4. At step 30, I'm at 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, that is the reality of information technology. I get to 1 billion. It makes a huge difference in the reality of what will happen. And this is not just an idle speculation about the future. As I mentioned, this is several billion times more powerful per dollar or per ruble than the computer that thousands of us shared when I was a student. It's also 100,000 times smaller. That's another exponential projection. And it's and that will continue. 25 years from now, this will again be 1 billion times more powerful for the same price. It'll be 100,000 times smaller again. It'll be the size of a blood cell, and we really will begin to integrate with them. That's not a completely new phenomenon. There are people walking around today with computers connected into their brains. For example, if you're a Parkinson's patient, or even someone who has a cochlear implant for the deaf, there are computerized organs like computerized pancreases that are being implanted in people. So this is already happening. Requires surgery today, but when it becomes the size of a blood cell, we'll just introduce them through the bloodstream, and that's one way in which we will integrate with machines. I want to show you some examples, but before I do, I just want to mention one other thing, which is this exponential growth of information technology, which is ultimately very transformative. It does not just apply to these gadgets we carry around. It ultimately will apply to everything we care about. Take, for example, health and medicine, which didn't used to be an information technology. It was just hit or miss. We would find things that happened to work. Oh, here's something that lowers blood pressure. Here's something that kills the HIV virus. They were discovered accidentally. We would systematically go through 10,000 compounds to find something that worked. It's called drug discovery. That's not an information technology. But with the collection of the genome, which is basically the software of life, we actually now are beginning to treat biology as the information process which it truly is. Genes are little software programs. How long do you go without updating the software on your phone? This is probably updating itself now as I speak. But I have software running in my body which hasn't been updated for thousands of years. And it's not just a metaphor. It's literally true. One of the genes, for example, the fat insulin receptor gene, says hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. And that was a very good idea 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, there was very little food, and you didn't know when you'd get your next meal, so you would store every calorie in your body so that you could last until the next meal came along. I would like to be able to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't need to do that anymore. And that's exactly what was done in animal experiments. We turned that gene off, and these animals ate an enormous amount and remained slim. And it wasn't a fake slimness. They didn't get diabetes, they didn't get heart disease, they lived 20% longer. They got the benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. And there's pharmaceutical companies rushing to bring that to the human market. I know the scientists who did that. And that's just one example of hundreds of projects where people are turning off or adding new genes. I'm involved with a project where we take cells out of the body, lung cells, add a new gene. This is for people that have a disease called pulmonary hypertension, which is caused by the lack of a certain gene. If you're missing a particular gene, you'll get this disease. The disease typically is fatal within 6 to 12 months. Children at 5 or 6 years old who don't have this gene get this disease and generally don't last more than a year. We took these lung cells out of the body, added the new gene that they were missing, replicated that 1,000,000-fold, injected it back in the body, went through the bloodstream, ended up back in the lungs, and actually cured this disease. And this is...
Нет русского перевода.
We've got some problems with the translation. Could you wait just for a while, please, if possible? Будьте добры, проверьте, пожалуйста, не